Yes.
That's fine. For the time being, we are waiting for the students, and we have very few in the room. So we are just thinking what to do further on.
Okay, just one question. I checked the YouTube link, and apparently it's not available.
Okay.
There are no new. There was two links, old link and new link.
There were two links installed, the old one and the new one.
Do you have the last link for
Do
this?
you have the last link for the video connection?
I don't think so. I checked the last one posted in Oksana's Facebook page, and apparently it's not working.
Останній в мене стояв на Facebook сторінці, і він не працює.
Ну, я поміняв лінк, я написав в листі, що ми поміняли лінк.
То я поставила йому той останній. Let us wait a minute. I will try to post another link. The link.
Okay.
Okay, напишіть мені зараз листа, я ще раз.
Can you just send me?
introduce you then very briefly to our people sitting there. First of all, the topic which we are going to discuss today was deemed to be about the human rights and mass protests and their comparisons over the world, and also in particular in Brazil and Ukraine, and comparing the activities, behavior, and so on. So the first picture that I wanted to say, like the very good mood for the Ukrainian protests. This was the picture about the Euromaidan process last December. Sorry, 13, December 13, yesterday. Just before it was the phase of the conflict when the use of force by police was already envisaged, and it was like the very calm but very hard position between relations between the protesters and the police, and they were trying to communicate with each other. You see on the picture the man playing piano in front of the police row, staying for the protesters. So with regard to that events and all with regard to the Maidan protest at all, we have several phases of that. The first one, when the students came, it was in November 2013. The second one, it was from November until December 2013, about the violence and the application of the violence by the police against the protesters. And then the third phase of the conflict was until January 2014, when the legislation and the new legislation against the protesters was adopted, and the pre-final fourth phase of the February was when the clashes come true and the application of the weapons was the case, and the final ones, after the February, the 22nd of February 2014, the phases of the negotiations and the escalation of the conflict. So what's going on? When we are talking about the Euromaidan and the revolution and the use of force and all the related links together, the Ukrainian society faces very few questions. The first one, what's going on? What is further on? We know in historical terms that afterwards we received also the annexation of the Crimea. The internal illustration process started initially, the cleaning up of the police, judges, courts, anti-corruption movements. Then we know also that the separatist movement in the eastern part of Ukraine became a very heavy one, and nowadays we have the military conflict in that part of Ukraine. And for the time being, we know that the issue of the responsibility still is open for Ukrainian society for all the acts and omissions by the state and by the protesters, by both sides, just to find people responsible for that. In that terms, it would be very interesting how it works in another states. Brazil faces the same developments, of the number of the conflicts is also, but then the June conflicts were also mentioned worldwide. So how this country operates with that issue is the floor for open then for Professor Dієго Валадареса Васконселоsa Nето from Brazil, who is international human rights law professor in Brazil, and who is going to present also the developments in this country to us. The floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. I believe in Ukraine right now it's already afternoon. Here in Brazil we're still in the morning, so almost afternoon already with our little delay. I hope you can hear me well. Do you confirm you can hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So, to start with, what I intend to do today. First, I would like to thank the Rule of Law Center from the University, the Catholic University of Ukraine, for inviting me for this lecture. It's an honor. It's a challenge as well. It's the fact that we're doing a distance distant lecture. Unfortunately, we were not able to do this lecture in presence. That was the initial idea some months back. I was teaching in Belarus, international humanitarian law in a university there. However, I returned to Brazil before we could manage and agree on a date. So we're having this lecture through the distance, through the internet. And I hope our connection will be fine and we'll have a fruitful discussion and dialogue here today. First of all, I would like to clarify the initial idea of this lecture. By engaging and talking to Professor Nето, I thought thoroughly of what to address in this meeting of ours today. And I think there are 3 steps and 3 topics which I would like to address and which I think can contribute somehow to the discussions that are going on in Ukraine right now and elsewhere regarding protests. So, to start with, I will begin my presentation by addressing human rights violations and as a cause of So to understand this interrelationship between mass protests and human rights violations, there is first an opposite direction relationship. That is, human rights violations cause protests. Second part of my presentation, and I'll explore that in this first part by addressing issues of including the preamble of the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Then I will proceed to the second part of my presentation, which is the core part of the presentation, which will explore the human rights limits and state responses to protests, and try to see how this human rights law constrains the capacity and ability of the state to respond to human rights protests, and what is reasonable, and how are these limitations to be interpreted in real case situations. And I'll use several case law from the European Court of Human Rights, a bit of the Human Rights Committee as well, and try to shed some light on how these limits interplay with protests. And the third part of my presentation will be about what happens afterwards. After protests have succeeded maybe, and now we have the right people in power, and maybe the wrong people start protesting. And so 2 issues there I intend to address in my final tier of the presentation. The first issue is about accountability for the protests after they have gone right or wrong, and after we have succeeded or surpassed the crisis where the protests are really mass protests that they don't usually do for a very long time. And also, how do we control and how do we address coherence in respecting human rights even when the wrong people are those who are protesting. So, but before I go to these 3 parts, let me just structuralize a bit protests in Brazil, especially the June 2013 protests. Then I was working as a consultant to the Human Rights Ministry of Brazil, the Human Rights Secretary that has the status of a ministry in Brazil, and in conjunction with the Organization of Ibero-American States. And I was researching on protests to write a case, an academic case for a simulation, for an academic competition on protests and human rights. And I was in Brasilia then, the capital of Brazil, when massive protests with millions of people involved really took over most of the big cities of Brazil and even small towns everywhere. These were the most massive protests since at least 20 years in Brazil, or even more. In certain aspects, these protests were very, very successful, but they also lost focus. But to explain a little bit of the history of these protests, I'll start by, before addressing them directly, showing a small video of a trailer of a movie that has subtitles. It's available on YouTube, that speaks a lot about these protests. And from this video onwards, I'll take over and explain some of these pictures which I took myself. But this is only to set the tone. So This video is a video from one of the main media outlets in Brazil, Folha de São Paulo. It's a big newspaper from São Paulo, and it's one of the documentaries that came out trying to explain the various facets, the various faces of these protests of June 2013. So I'll play the video and come back in 2 minutes.
Can you hear us? We cannot hear you.
So, what is this? What happened here? And what were these massive protests that took over the streets in Brazil? How did they come out? To tell the story of these protests, I had to go back a little bit in history of Brazil, in the past decade. Several social movements claiming for economic, social, and cultural rights, especially claiming for the right of adequate living and the right for having access to the infrastructure of the city, started protesting, especially students, largely against rising fares of public transportation. In Brazil, we're one of the countries in the world with the biggest social gap between rich and poor. It's a country where poverty, extreme poverty, is still present, though it's a rich country in many ways. It's one of the rich, it's the 7th biggest economy in the world. But the cities are planned as many other parts in the world, especially for the rich. The poor live very far from downtown or from areas in the city where the labor is available. They have been expelled some years ago to other places from the city. And a massive protest started emerging in some cities of Brazil, northeastern Brazil and south of Brazil, to try to claim that fares cannot go higher because this will affect the income of labor, of common labor force, the wages of the poor and those who receive the minimum wage in general. So these protests adopted some violent strategies, and that have been happening for many years in many cities, and sometimes with successfully curtailing and impeding the rise in fares. And this is a reality in Brazil. The media always cover these guys protesting as vandals, as violent protests, punks, people who really don't have no no citizenship feeling, and they just want to destroy public property, private property, and so on. However, last year, we were holding the first mega event, sports event, from a series that we're still holding here in my country, in Brazil. In 2013, we were holding the Confederations Cup. And the Confederations Cup was putting the spotlights of cameras, of media outlets throughout the world, New York Times, Al Jazeera, Russian Today, you name it, Xinhua, all major TV outlets and radio outlets, newspapers, were having their anchors brought to Brazil to cover the first of the sports events, the Confederations Cup, and as a preparation for the World Cup that took place this year in 2014. And some of these protests happened again in Brazil, and some international media was starting to throw some lenses to these protests. Apart from these guys, those claiming for a reducing of wages, of fares, public transportation bus fares, there are also those landless people and homeless people that were protesting just for the sake of trying to pressure the government for more housing policies for the poor. And they made a protest burning some tires close to the national stadium in Brasilia, and that had a big media coverage in a very critical manner to the protesters themselves. But then Al Jazeera and some others picked up those protests and started to try to explore, hey, what's behind those protests? And that enraged a lot the police and the government and state government. The police is usually controlled by the state governments in Brazil. And that enraged them and made them perceive that actually these protests were being opportunists because of these major events. So the first protests in the beginning of the Confederations Cup were met with very strong police violence. Tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper sprays, and so on. And that was answered by a viral feeling that actually the government and the police was curtailing our right to protest, whatever the reason was. So people took to the streets, and maybe the most important moment was in the first week of the Confederations Cup, when the people in Brasilia, and I was there, took over the Congress of Brazil, and thousands of people walked on the roof of the Congress. So these pictures you can see here, these three pictures were taken by me in the top of the Congress. I was there with the protesters as a researcher, but also somehow as a protester as well. And these three pictures of Guy Fawkes on top of the Congress, of a poster saying that a silent country does not change, asking for other topics that had nothing to do with the first protest, such as the non-religious state, because we had some priests, radical fundamentalist priests, that were against gay rights, against the rights of minorities. Black was a bit racist, that was taking over the Human Rights Commission in Congress. So there were people claiming for the for a non-religious state. And here you can have a bit of the perspective of what happened. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of people in an area that's not allowed for anyone to step in. And these protests grew much stronger. Some people died during the protests, be it for tear gas, be it because of running from the police and falling from bridges. And also, when protests were held in the slums, when black people were involved, poor black people of Brazil were involved in the protests, many of the protesters were shot with live ammunition. Not in the streets, not where the middle class were protesting, but where the poor were protesting, live ammunition sometimes were used against these protesters. And in fact, just to sum up on this first part, explaining Brazilian protests. These protests were largely successful in many ways. The fairs were brought down, the rises on the fairs were cancelled, the fairs were brought down, and various topics in Brazil were brought to the attention of the international media, the international community, and the government had to respond to many of the demands that were brought to the streets. In the long run, whether they were successful, that's a more complicated issue that we can discuss later in the question and answering part of our discussion. But to go back to my first roadmap outline, let's go to the causal nexus of human rights violations and mass protests. Okay, is there a relationship? And that seems to be actually a quite obvious discussion. The Unification of Human Rights itself mentioned in its three first preambulatory clauses that recognition of the inherent dignity and of equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So, the respect for human dignity is a foundation also for peace. Hence, if human dignity is to be upheld, if peace is to be verified, human dignity has to be respected. In second preambulatory clause, we'll read that whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear and want, has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. Hence, again, barbarous violations of human rights have shocked humanity and caused the Holocaust and serious war, and it was a big aspect of the Second World War. And the most important of the preambulatory clauses of the Declaration, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Hence, here the relationship between human rights and protests is very clear. So, if we respect human rights, and human rights are protected by the rule of law, then there's a hope that perhaps we won't be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion. And so protests, civil strikes, mass protests, and consequences like that. So this is actually one of the first points that should be followed if we are to have human rights respected. That if we want to have a stable society with less mass protests and violence, human rights should be upheld. And this relationship can be verified on the basis. The errors with a man, Mr. Boazizi, known as Basbusa, who set himself on fire after being first suffering economic, social, cultural rights deprivations. He was in big debt, food prices were high, he could not sustain his family. And second, he also suffered abuse, apparently from what witnesses have mentioned, abuse of authority. His civil rights, his right not to be treated inhumanely, were violated in the hours preceding him setting himself on fire. And when this man in Tunisia, in Sidi Bouaziz, in a small city in Tunisia, set himself on fire, he then, just a question, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, just because I read something here. So when this man set himself on fire, the whole region was set on fire as well, fighting for human rights and against oppression. Another example, contemporary one, of rebellion against violations of human rights is what is happening right now in the United States of America. racial profiling, police violence, using lethal force, and targeting especially black people has been condemned and by the black minorities that have rebelled against police officers in various cities, starting from Ferguson and now in New York City, with episodes of lethal force used by police against black people, many times unarmed, many times unnecessary, and impunity prevailing in these cases. And that has set mass protests there as well in the US. A third example of mass protests in what has been called perhaps the Mexican Arab Spring is the protests that are happening in Mexico right now, especially in the past few weeks, months, regarding the killing, apparently killing, but the disappearing of 43 students that were executed by drug traffickers and delivered to them by police officers. This has set a wave of massive protests in Mexico as well. Many times violent protests. It's not only immediate protests that happen due to violence and violations of human rights that have happened right now. Lack of accountability in the long run tend to give rise to these mass protests when combined with other factors that spark these protests. So just to mention one episode, the picture here on your right lower corner of this circle is of protests against a massive killing, a massacre happened in a prison in Benghazi, Libya, the Abu Salim prison. There was a riot in this prison, and the solution adopted then by the regime, still with Muammar Gaddafi heading this regime, was to kill 1,270 inmates in one day. This can be identified as one of the causes of the Libyan uprising. The immediate causes, not the immediate, but the immediate causes. The violence and the scale of the human rights violations then, I could say here without any doubt that you could classify that episode as a crime against humanity, was pending in the conscience of the inhabitants of Benghazi, and Benghazi was one of the cities where protests grew to civil strife and open armed conflict very early in the situation that unfolded in Libya. Finally, not only civil and political rights, as most of these cases are about, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. So the protests in Brazil, though it was a response to police violence against protests of fair race, they were also very much related to corruption and the lack of investment, especially in hospitals, education, the priority to invest in a mega event for FIFA and not investing on economic, social, and cultural rights of the Brazilian population. So, having discussed briefly that on human rights violations as causes of massive protests, we pass now to the second tier of our presentation regarding the limits for restricting and repressing protests. There are several aspects that we can discuss here. And to start with, when can you restrict the freedom of expression? Freedom of expression can be restricted only when prescribed by law and necessary, and implying necessary proportional, for respect of rights or reputation of others, second, protection of national security or of public order, ordre public, or other public health or morals. This is Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All the regional instruments will adopt similar provisions. The European Court Convention will adopt more specific provisions, but the main idea is contained here. So how can you restrict the freedom of expression? Only under these two possibilities. And but governments, just by reading this provision, tend to apply this in a very broad manner, many times disrespecting the necessary aspect of these two exceptions, respect of rights and reputations of others and ordre public in general. two cases that I would like to mention here on how these rights have been restricted unduly are the Human Rights Committee's case on Alexandrov versus Belarus, which was a case concerning a peaceful march of three gentlemen walking in a city in Belarus. If I recall well, it was in Minsk itself. And they were walking in the sidewalk, not disturbing the traffic, silently, carrying the flag, this flag that you can see. That is a flag that symbolizes the first Belarusian Republic in 1918. It was a flag that was temporarily considered for Belarus after the end of the Soviet Union, but then Belarus kept its older flag. But that became, actually, the use of the Belarusian language, the use of this flag, became somehow a political statement against the current government, against the government of President Lukashenko. And this was clearly a peaceful protest, silent one, only three persons walking down the street, carrying those flags, a flower in their hands, and making a point saying, we're not pleased with this government, we want something else. Mr. Alexandrov was actually prosecuted, arrested, kept for a while, and had to pay a fine for this peaceful protest. And the government tried to explain this restriction on the basis that it was prescribed by law and it was necessary for the protection of public order. The protest did not even affect the traffic. It did not affect rights of others. It was not even a mass protest, but it was restricted clearly because the regime was not pleased that somebody was protesting against itself. This kind of limitations, blanket limitations to the right to protest is clearly a violation of the freedom of expression, and it's unduly applying the restriction to the freedom of expression. And the court decided that it was a violation of Article 19. The Human Rights Committee decided that was a violation of Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Regarding the respect of the right or reputation of others, especially in Latin America, I wouldn't know, and in the question and answer session, I would be pleased to hear about if the same thing happens in Ukraine right now. But in Latin America, it's very common for governments to adopt something we call the desacato criminal laws. What is the desacato criminal laws? It's criminalizing the criticism, many times offensive, use of aggressive words, and going against the reputation of governmental authorities. And in many cases, this can carry a high fine, prison terms, and so on. The Inter-American system has a system on human rights. If you're not acquainted, we have in the American hemisphere, in the Organization of American States, we have an Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and an Inter-American Court on Human Rights. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has stated since 1994 that the desacato rules, criminalizing the criticism of government officials, is against the freedom of expression. The threshold for protecting the reputation of governmental officials should be lower than that of, or at least the same, as all other members of society, all other citizens. Because since government officials are exercising a public function, they should be even more subject to criticism than other individuals. And hence, the use of criminal law to suppress criticism of government officials has been considered a violation of the freedom of expression. And in particular, this has also been recognized in a declaration, the Inter-American Declaration on the Principles of Freedom of Expression, it's Principle 11. And here I have a small anecdote to tell you. During those protests in Brasilia, where I took those pictures, I saw a policeman almost driving a car over a protester for no reason whatsoever. I came to the policeman driving the car and asked his name, politely asked his name. The official was mad at me because I asked his name, and I was detained. He told me that he would tell me his name in the police department. He detained me, and he accused me of the desacato. He said that I called him bad words, and I said he was the son of a female dog, if you get what I mean, and which I never pronounced. And I might be sued because, and criminally responsible myself, because of the abusive use of this desacato rules that in themselves are already abusive. So even if I, in that circumstances, had called that policeman son of a female dog, even the guy almost drove a car over a girl and almost killed a peaceful protester, unarmed, that was walking back home for no reason, because he was mad, because the protest was already taking place for over 9 hours, and he wanted to go back to his place, and he was upset. So he had to use his anger against somebody, and he used the anger against the girl. So I did not call him that, and that's an issue because he has the public faith on what he states that I said. But even if I had done so, wouldn't it be reasonable for me to be aggressive against a man who's almost killing someone else? And would it be reasonable for me to try to protect someone else by calling attention of this policeman somehow? And unfortunately, the Brazilian Supreme Court still recognizes the desacato norms as an appropriate criminal provision in clear violation of the jurisprudence of the inter-American system. There's another limitation, which I'll come back to it later on, to the freedom of expression, apart from these two, but it's actually within these two, that it's hate speech, but I'll come back to this one later on. Restriction to the freedom of assembly, Article 21 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is very similar to the restrictions of those of the freedom of expression. So usually the same restriction will be used in some mass protests is a group of people assembling to express their opinions. So they interconnect very much in the situation of protests. And the restrictions are also, they can only be placed and imposed in conformity with the law, which is necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security or public safety, public order, the protection of public health and morals, or the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. So it's very, very similar, the same kind of exception in the freedom of assembly, and also in the restriction of freedom of association, which many times, and in Brazil there's an interesting tier for that. But it only can be restricted again in lawful restrictions on the public order and rights and freedoms of others. But there's a special tier for it. First of all, police forces and armed forces can be restricted from this right, from association, and so that they won't be able to become part of a political party, for instance, so they will be impartial in all circumstances. And second, an interesting tier for that is that the freedom of association it not only has to be respected by the government, but governments should also ensure respect to the freedom of association. In the Brazilian protests, and perhaps you didn't get it, but there was a short line in the video I just showed before that mentioned that some protesters were shouting, saying, "No political parties, no political parties," because the protest became by non-political parties protesting, by horizontal, non-organized protests, spontaneous, viral movement of people going to the streets and protesting for many reasons, many of them contradictory to each other. And some parties raised some flags, especially left-wing parties in Brazil. And these parties, and in many cases, some protesters with a very strong right, almost, how can I say, intolerant approach to what was going on, attacked using physical force against those raising flags and of left-wing parties. And the government, police forces many times omitted themselves from protecting these protesters. So if a person is a part of an association, wants to raise a flag and participate in the protest, of course it cannot curtail the idea itself of the main protest, but the government has to protect these protesters' freedom of association and identification with a certain political party, and cannot allow other protesters to attack them and physically attack them, curtailing their right to express their political visions. But finally, where I want to spend most of my energy in the second part of my presentation is, okay, we've seen a bit of what are some restrictions and misuse of restrictions in the protests. But once the protests are happening, legal or illegal, what can the use of force do in these circumstances? How can the police and the government, other law enforcement officials respond to these protests and disperse these protests? First of all, the first document to consult in this aspect is the basic principles on the use of force and firearms by law enforcement officials. In particular, Principle 13, that states that in the dispersal of assemblies that are unlawful but non-violent, law enforcement officials shall avoid the use of force where that is not practicable, shall restrict such force to the minimum extent necessary. And Principle 14, so even if it's necessary to use force, in the dispersal of violent assemblies, enforcement officials may use firearms, and here I would include even gas canisters, firearms that will fire gas canisters, rubber bullets, and so on. I'll come to that later. Only when less dangerous means are not practicable, and only to the minimum extent necessary. Law enforcement officials shall use firearms in such cases, shall not use firearms in such cases except in accordance with Principle 9. And Principle 9 is the one that states that all constraints should be applied in the use of firearms, and intentional use of firearms, intentional use of force, especially firearms, can only take place to protect life from immediate threat. The life of the one using self-defense, or the life of others. So in only those circumstances can lethal force be used in an imminent threat to life. So going to lethal force in particular, there are several cases where lethal force has been used in the protests, and that clarify lethal violence has been used and clarify some aspects of it. In Euromaidan, and Professor Oksana started explaining a little bit, in Euromaidan apparently 70 persons were killed by snipers, and there are several versions of it. Apparently members of of special forces that were loyal to the then president of the country have used the I lost you. I don't know, but let's
So,
where we were.
your work is again.
So I was speaking about Euromaidan.
Yes.
Okay, so in Nero Maidan, legal force against protesters was clearly in relation to it. There's a very important case relating to that. That light ammunition cannot be used, lethal weapons cannot be used against protesters in any case. In particular, at least unless strictly necessary to protect the life of individuals. The case of Gulish versus Turkey is one of the leading cases of the European Court on Human Rights, in which one of the reasons why the court found that the right to life was violated. It was a protest, a violent protest in Kurdistan, and during this violent protest, the police forces did not have dispersal materials, did not have rubber bullets, did not have tear gas canisters, did not have enough protection to themselves, and they only have live ammunition, military weapons. And they used that. They got threatened by the protesters that were throwing stones and approached them, and they used these weapons against the protesters. And the court found that there was a clear violation of the right to life because even though the soldiers did not want to shoot at the protesters, the fact that they only had these kind of weapons and did not use less lethal weapons was a clear violation to the right to life. And we'll go back to less lethal equipment later. But another case I'd like to mention is the one in the picture to the right now. This picture is the picture of the body of Danny McCann, who was a member of the Irish Republican Army in Gibraltar in 1988, who was killed during the Operation Flavius. Mr. McCann was a member of a volunteer of the Irish Republican Army, and apparently he was planning, together with some associates, to plant a car bomb in the main plaza in Gibraltar, an exclave of the United Kingdom in the south of France. And during the operation, the police forces were monitoring the whole procedures of the suspected members of IRA. They monitored while they entered Gibraltar. They monitored them when they approached this plaza. They knew that the plan was to explode the car bomb. They wanted them to park the car, walk some meters from the car. Just then, fearing that the car would explode and that would be a car bomb, they started the operation and tried to, it's doubtful to say, but apparently they would allegedly try to arrest them. They said, police pointed their guns to these members of IRA. These members of the IRA started running. And while they started running, they were shot. One of the policemen alleged that one of the members was reaching to inside his suit, possibly trying to touch a remote control to explode the car. Okay, let's try again. I don't know what happened again, but I believe the connection is good. I don't know what's happened, but let's see. Oh, you got me speaking about the case of Nето, right?
Okay, yes.
So, in that case, the right to life of Mr. McCain and his associates was considered to be violated by the European Court of Human Rights. Not because of the policeman who shot the last bullet and killed Mr. McCain, but because the whole operation, the planning of the operation, was not taking into account the right to life of the citizens of Gibraltar by letting Mr. McCain to carry out the operation until the last moment when he could have exploded a car bomb in the middle of the square. The right to life of those citizens could be violated, And the right to life of Mr. McKinney itself, it would have been better to arrest him before, even not having that many proofs, than waiting for the last moment when only taking his life was a possibility for the police forces. So here we have another tier that it's important to analyze when assessing the right to life in the case of protests. The planning of the operation, the planning of the whole procedures in trying to contain even a violent protest has to take into account all the efforts to avoid the loss of life. In the protests in my city, Belu Orizonti, in 2013, about 5 persons fell. I don't know if you can see, but this is 2 bridges that fly, 2 flyovers that fly together about 2 meters, 3 meters apart from each other. And during the protest, this is very close to the stadium in our city in Brazil, where the Brazilian team played twice, and massive protests in this avenue were held. Some protesters tried to reach the stadium. Police responded with tear gas, rubber bullets. Protesters fled to these 2 flyovers and sometimes tried, with smoke screen because of the tear gas, they tried to jump from one bridge to the other bridge. And the picture is taken exactly from the gap between these 2 bridges, which for the protesters was not always, they were not always able to see this gap. So while the smoke was happening, many protesters tried to jump from one bridge to the other, and they didn't see, because of an optic illusion, that they were actually too far apart. And they fell down there, had big trauma, and 2 protesters passed away. And actually, this happened in 3 different days, apart for 4 days of each other, that protesters jumped and fell there, having serious bodily injuries. And the police did not take any measure in the planning of the next protests for the next game to close this bridge or to make signals or to avoid protesters from jumping from this bridge to another. And so, even though it wasn't policemen who caused the death of these protesters who were jumping and falling down there, both of them died in the last protest when they fell and had some they fell with their heads down and had very hard brain injuries, and after some weeks passed away. The police did not plan accordingly to avoid that to happen again, and it was completely predictable because it happened once, twice, 3 times. So, in analyzing the operation facing the protests, one has to see the whole planning of the operation, and the whole planning has to be has to have regard to the right to life and avoid the violation of this right. So, regarding lethal force, this is the main points I'd like to call the attention on how to react to protests. First of all, ammunition is normally a serious violation of the right to life and cannot be held. Second, the whole planning of the operation should be taking into account the right to life. Just 1 second. I just received I just want to make sure the message. Okay, going back here. The second tier of how protesters' use of force has to be carried out against protesters, to disperse protests, even when they're illegal, is that law enforcement officials have to be protected with shields and rubber bullets, gas canisters, have to have all the infrastructure possible to avoid the use of lethal force. First and foremost, they have to be adequately physically protected, because if they face any dangers coming from protesters, angry protesters with rockets, with rocks, fireworks, etc., they have to be able to protect themselves without counter-reacting and using violence against this protest if this violence is not necessary. So shields, helmets, Other kinds of armor has to be available for police, especially when protests have a big tendency, mass protests have a big tendency into becoming violent protests. And there's a leading case on that. So rubber bullets, gas canisters, but there's a very important leading case on that. That is the case of Gaju and Giuliani versus Lee. This episode was concerning protests held during the G8 summit in Geneva and in Italy, and some beginners of the black bloc tactics were engaging with very violent protests against the police. One of the officers was injured. He was in of the police forces of Italy, of the Carabinieri, and protesters approached this jeep and started throwing rockets, broke the window, the glass window behind this car, this jeep. And one protester, Mr. Giuliani, who is shown here holding a gas can, I forgot how to mention, but fire extinguisher, a fire extinguisher in his hands. He was about to throw this fire extinguisher against the car, and the police officer shot him, and apparently the bullet even touched the fire extinguisher before it reaching his head, was dispersed on the way, and he died immediately. Worse than that, to escape the situation, the police officer that was driving the car actually drove the car over the body of Mr. Giuliani twice. The European Court of Human Rights, in a very controversial decision, decided that in that case there was no violation of the right to life of Mr. Giuliani because that live ammunition was used as a last resort, and because that fire extinguisher, if it reached the vehicle, it could have killed him. So, in a very exceptional manner, one could concede that firearms can be used sometimes in the context of protests in order to protect the life of the law enforcement officials, of the third persons, and that was, in a very strange way, I would say, what the court found in the case of Gaju and Giuliani. I have doubts if that was the last resort and there were some dissenting votes in the European Court of Human Rights. In that case, some dissenting voices, but that was the finding. But the point is that even when the use of force, police officers are not using arms with lethal capacity, no general lethal capacity, but they're using rubber bullets, gas canisters, pepper spray, still the right of physical integrity, not to be tortured, and even the right to life can be violated. Here we have some pictures, and maybe you remember this lady who was shown in that short video we saw some while ago with her eyes really purple from the shots she got. She's a journalist. She was taking pictures from the protests and from the police officers acting in the protest, and the policeman aimed the rubber bullet directly at her face and shot against her because she was filming, and he was probably disturbed by it because she was filming. And she almost lost, gladly she didn't, but she almost lost her eyesight on her right eye. A very similar case is a case that has happened in the European Court of Human Rights, but not rubber bullets, but gas canisters used by the Turkish forces in a protest, illegal protests in the Kurdistan region of Turkey against the detention of several members of the PKK. The protest that unfolded after this, these detentions, they many times were violent. They many times were considered illegal, and the police, we could acknowledge that the police could have dispersed. They had the right, perhaps, to disperse, and could lawfully and according to international human rights law disperse those protests. But when using gas canisters, instead of shooting the gas canisters up so that it will make a parabole and the gas would disperse the protesters, it was used against the face of the protesters directly. And that caused serious body injury to a 13-year-old boy, Abdullah Yasha, and this was taken to the European Court of Human Rights and considered as a violation of physical integrity with reference including to the basic principle of 13 above mentioned. The use of gas has also been considered illegal by the European Court of Human Rights when used in closed doors or used against people that clearly are more vulnerable, like children, elders, pregnant women, and so on. In Brazil, during the protests, one of the deaths we had during the June protests in 2013 was of a man who was, he had some health, he was an actor, a dwarf, a short man, and he had some respiratory illness, asthma, some kind of problems, and gas canisters were shot against him in an area that was not really open air. So as the European Court of Human Rights has acknowledged, using gas canister in closed doors, in areas where they are closed, and as it has happened in Brazil before, even in prisons, in places of detention, tend to become clear violations of human rights as well, because they can cause death, as it has happened, and serious health consequences that can be very harsh. Another case regarding pepper spray is the Aligunis case, where protests against the NATO summit in 2004 in Turkey was used against protesters, peaceful protesters that were in the area that was established by the government, where people... Okay, let's continue. So I was speaking about the case of Aligunis in the NATO summit. And the court again found that that was a violation of the right to freedom of expression and the right and physical integrity, the use of pepper spray, abusive use of pepper spray. And there's a small funny video I'd like to play to you. I think I'm already exceeding the time, but I'll play a short funny video as well from a comedy show of Brazil, an online comedy show we have in Brazil, that explains a bit why and what are the reasons that take police officers many times to use rubber bullets, or at least explains a bit of the context. I'll play the video and then make a short comment to it. Yes? Does it work?
Just press no voice on the video.
Oh, the video is without sound?
Yeah. Just put off your speakers.
For a while.
For a while, and then it will work.
Okay. Okay, let's try again.
Huh? Okay. Now it worked.
Uma coisa
I hope you could understand a little bit of the Brazilian humor there, but the point is, the use of less lethal weapon, these weapons many times called non-lethal weapons, they can actually become lethal, and they do cause violations of the right to physical integrity very often. So even their use should be restrained at the most, as far as possible. And training of police forces should enshrine that principle, that force should only be used when strictly necessary, even when less lethal weapons are being used. The fact that you equip the police with less lethal weapons, and that's a duty, does not give you a free hand to use them and disperse them against the protesters anyhow. You have to restrain and only use them when it's strictly necessary. If you can disperse through other means of violent protest, you should disperse through other means. And there are some other means, strategies, that sometimes even then can be considered a violation of the freedom of expression. And here I'd like to mention just three episodes which I regard that raises some reflections if they're not violating, though they're not the use of force in the attacking the integrity of the protesters, but they can be a restriction to the freedom of movement, the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly. First of them is the Cattling, which is a strategy that has been used by police officers in Brazil very often lately, and that was something used in the UK, in the United Kingdom very often, and still used there very often, which is encircling protesters inside a certain zone where they cannot move anymore and where they cannot use their violent energy against shops and so on, blackwashing, to break windows, glasses, and so on. So you try to encircle them in a certain area to avoid more violent consequences of the protests and more violent strategies to contain these protests. The problem of this, and though the European Court of Human Rights, the Grand Chamber, in a very controversial decision of 2001, of the protests regarding the 2001 May Day in the Oxford Circus in London, the European Court in that case decided that was, in that particular special circumstance, encircling those protesters was not a violation of the freedom of movement and freedom of expression of the protesters. However, governments have been resorting to this strategy in an abusive manner. In Brazil, I witnessed myself now in 2014 during protests during the World Cup, that many times protesters were prevented, clearly peaceful, joyful even protesters were prevented from participating in, from making themselves heard. Their protests, and really fun protests against the World Cup. They were against the World Cup. They wanted to make themselves heard, but in a very good sense of humor, using funny strategies, theater plays, playing football in the streets, and so on. The police encircled the protests, preventing them to join and to have be in touch with those that were celebrating the World Cup, not because they feared violence, but clearly, to a large extent, to prevent media and foreign visitors to see that there were people in Brazil that were not happy about the protests. So the Cattling strategy, I would argue, cannot be used as a strategy to prevent protests at all. It can only be used when it's clear that these protests tend to evolve to a violent protest with harsher consequences, that more harmful means will be needed to suppress them, and only to the extent necessary for that, and not as curtailing the ability of protesters to protest at all. And finally, there are two other strategies that have been verified in many cases, which is trying to argue that the protest sit-ins have some health hazards, as has been the case in the Tahrir Square and in some protests in Egypt, and also especially in the protests of the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York. The protest was dispersed on the grounds of sanitary necessity, but clearly, at least from my reading, that was not the case. The protests were actually happening in a peaceful manner, but because neighbors were disturbed and because Wall Street was not happy about it. The city administration and the police forces started using a series of excuses, including having the support of some judicial decisions, to clear up the site for cleaning purposes and not ever allowing the protesters to come back to that site again. And finally, the most extreme measure I've seen in protest lately is the measure adopted by Bahrain, the government of Bahrain, which decided that the spot where the protests were held, the square, the Pearl Square roundabout, where the protests of Shia, mass protests of Shia in Bahrain were taking place, was to be completely destroyed. So the place itself of protest was completely destroyed. The roundabout was destroyed. It became a street crossing, closed for many months, and to attack the symbol of the protest itself, which also does not seem to me to be an appropriate answer to freedom of expression, when you try to curtail all aspects of the protest simply because you want to erase any discontent to your government. The way to address this discontent is better to be through dialogue and not through destroying the symbols of protests. Finally, and I think I'm exceeding my time, to the left of our presentation, regarding accountability and coherence in responding to protests, I'd like to make two very brief comments. Regarding accountability, and in Brazil we still don't have that for protests that happened in 2013 and 2014, violations of human rights, especially when they involve the commission of crimes, have to be followed by the right to access to justice and the criminal responsibility even of those committing those violations, especially when there are widespread violations and serious violations of human rights, like widespread breach of the right to life. It is indispensable for those responsible for their acts to be held accountable. In Brazil, we have a decision we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that has been helping us to go through transitional justice. We've ended our military dictatorship where many violations of human rights were committed back in the 80s, in the end of the 80s. But still, all those torture, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings against those who protested, those who fought against the government, the military dictatorship in Brazil, have not been solved. No one has been criminally responsible for those acts. And though the Supreme Court recognizes that the Brazilian law on amnesty would cover those who committed those acts, there's a decision of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights saying that Brazil has the duty to prosecute and sentence those who have committed those acts back then because there are serious violations of human rights. No statutory limitations can be imposed to serious violations of human rights. And the Brazilian Truth and Reconciliation Commission now is working, recommending that the Supreme Court and Brazilian legislation has to be revised on that aspect, and we should hold accountable those who have committed serious violations of human rights. As we protest the recent violation against so far, only those protesting have been sentenced by courts. Those that abused the use of force against protesters have not been held accountable at all so far. And to more extreme cases, as has been the case with Ukraine, and as has evolved in eastern Ukraine, Donbass, and in particular, it is really important that we upheld the role of the International Criminal Court. And that I'll leave for further discussion. I believe that in Ukraine, there are some issues that we have to discuss on that because only the circumstance of Euromaidan were referred to the International Criminal Court. And that, from my perspective as a human rights lawyer, does not seem to serve the cause of justice because it's encircling the possibility of accountability just to one side and just to one circumstance. Other serious violations of human rights have occurred, and widespread atrocities have occurred in Ukraine in southern Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine afterwards, by different sides of the conflicts and the protests that have happened, and these are not reflected in international criminal court, apparently for constitutional reasons, and I'm looking forward to discuss this further in our question and answer session. And finally, related to that, we have to uphold the principles of responding to protests in every circumstance. Even when the right people win and succeed, another government comes to power with bigger commitment to human rights. When the wrong people go, and I put that between quotes, when the wrong people, be them whoever you want to call wrong people, go to the streets and protest, we have to respect the right to freedom of expression as well. And in Brazil, we've got a very interesting situation where those who lost the elections, the recent elections, where a left government was kept in government in office, some members that were not happy with the results of the elections started asking for the end of the democracy. This poster says that it's asking for the end of democracy and for military coup to happen in the country. So how to deal with that? And I think the way to think is first to guarantee everyone's right to freedom of expression and to uphold all those standards I've mentioned above. But in particular, if those protests cross a line, which is the one of pressing for violence, pressing for attacking minorities, and pressing for the end of democracy, further discussion should be made, and we should consider how far can these protests go. For that reason, I refer you to the Rabbit Plan of Action, which is a plan of action for combating hatred, incitement. It's a plan of action of the United Nations for combating hatred and incitement. I believe I have exceeded my time far beyond what I need, but we're also a little bit late due to connection problems. But I'd like to have now some opening for questions, comments, and I'm looking forward to have a dialogue with you, and I hope with all the small connection problems, you still could get most of the relevant points of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for doing that for us. And let's maybe start this session with the questions and the comments on the issue. I will pose a question. While you started your lecture, you were mentioning the Ministry of Human Rights in Brazil. And this is really a new experience for Ukraine, because as you see, it was, like you mentioned, also the Commission for the Truth and Reconciliation in the society. In Ukraine, it is still the case where such commission will be needed for the society to deal with the conflicts in the eastern part, in the Crimea, but also with the Euromaidan issues. What was the idea behind the creation of the Ministry of Human Rights? What are the functions of that ministry? And how it works within the governmental structure as in Brazil?
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. To start answering it, it's first to mention that Brazil had since it's come back to democracy since the mid-90s, we have prepared some human rights plans of actions. And the human rights plans of actions, they foresee a series of actions, cross-cutting, transversal actions that should be taken out by several sectors of the government, civil society, justice systems, to uphold and to advance in our implementation of human rights in Brazil. And in that sense, in 2002, when we had our first left-wing government, when Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva became the president of Brazil, it created a ministry on he created a ministry on human rights to coordinate the governmental efforts for implementing human rights instruments. he became with a very strong, he came to office, especially in his first mandate, with very strong social movement, human rights defenders support. And to demonstrate his commitment to human rights support, he created this ministry. The first minister was Mr. Yumai Miranda. And the idea was to take several aspects of human rights in Brazil. He did not even create one ministry. Two other ministries, they are called secretariats. They have the status of a ministry in Brazil. But the three secretariats I would like to mention were created in the federal level. So Brazil is a federal country. We have a federal level, we have state level. They work differently. I'll try to go through at least my state, the state of Мінас-Жераїс, briefly as well. In the federal level, 8 ministries, 3 secretariats with the status of a ME that were strictly for human rights. The first of them being the Human Rights Secretariat, which I'll explain a little bit in depth in a while. I prepared some presentations. I was expecting this question to come. The second secretariat is the Secretariat for the Promotion of Racial Equality. Brazil is still a country where black people, indigenous people, lag behind white people in many aspects, in health, access to health, in life expectancy, in child mortality, in mother mortality, labor-giving mortality, in various aspects. Black people are those mostly affected by lethal violence, by police operations, and so on. So, standard of education. So there's a ministry to coordinate with all other departments of the government measures and strategies for enhancing racial equality. And so, because of the creation of this ministry, through the articulation of this ministry with other, with the legislative body, branch of the government, with our Congress, with our civil society, and so on, we have adopted many affirmative action for black people, and it has played a major role in promoting racial equality in Brazil. Also, we have a Secretariat for the Promotion of Women's Rights, which, as in most countries in the world, women still lag behind in salaries, in many other aspects. So there's a Secretariat entirely dedicated, with the status of the ministry, entirely dedicated to articulating, coordinating policies for ensuring the rights of women. But in particular, I think most generally, the Human Rights Secretariat is the one responsible for various aspects of human rights. And I'll show, though it's in Portuguese, its organizational structure. The ministry has several aspects. It has a human rights ombudsman that's linked to this ministry. And that's perhaps a small problem in Brazil. Brazil does not have, it lags behind other countries, because it does not have a national human rights institution according to the Paris principles. So that's something we still have to remedy in our human rights protection structure right now. But we have an ombudsman and human rights linked to the Ministry of Human Rights. And then we have many secretaries, including, before explaining the particular sectors of the human rights secretariat, the operational ones, we have international advisory, where I have worked as a consultant last year, and there's a chance I might join them again soon, but as a consultant. And the international advisory helps Brazil, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Public Advocate's Office to answer all cases of the Inter-American System of Human Rights. There are hundreds of cases right now pending against Brazil, in over 100 cases at least, pending against Brazil in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and a few cases also pending before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So the International Advisory have a group of specialists that will be fully dedicated to answering and assisting the implementation of cases of the Inter-American human rights system. And there's another sector that will be engaged with the Universal Periodic Review, the preparation of the national report, the answering of recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review in Geneva, the special rapporteurs, the special procedures of the human rights councils in the various topics, thematic topics, and assist them when visiting Brazil, for instance, and so on. They also engaged with the treaty bodies of the human rights treaties that are hosted in Geneva, and also with human rights institutions from other bodies, from the International Law Labor Organization, the Mercosur meeting of the high authorities on human rights, and so on. So it has a major role in assisting the whole Brazilian government in answering and implementing, engaging with international bodies related to human rights. But it also, the Human Rights Ministry also implements national policies on human rights and coordinate national policies. From coordinating and monitoring the National Plan of Action for implementing human rights. The last one, the plan of action of the third plan of action, is currently being monitored in Brazil, and it has several lines of action, including promotion of equality, transitional justice and accountability, ensuring that preventing torture, preventing other mistreatments by police forces, training the police forces on human rights. So it has many, many aspects. So it monitors those policies, and it has some secretariats dedicated to specific topics. So we have some advisors under the ministry dedicated to specific topics. So one of the departments will be on the rights of LGBTI people. One department will be working on rights and promotion of the rights of the child. And under the rights of the child, we will have including a program for protecting children threatened of death. In our favelas and our slums, we have many children still, mostly black, young boys, who are killed every day. And so we have a special program inspired by the Witness Protection Program that will be working for ensuring the right to life of these kids, and other strategies for promoting the right to life and ensuring the reducing the death of lethal violence against the child in Brazil. We also have a sector dedicated to the rights of persons with disabilities, which will be promoting the several departments and strategies for the rights of these persons with disabilities. There's a department on the rights of elder people, and we have a protection of human rights sector that will be fully dedicated for implementing policies for preventing torture and so on, and other violations of human rights by the state. For instance, we're just creating an OPCAT, Optional Protocol for the Convention Against Torture mechanism. It's starting to work on January next year for preventing torture in the country. We're also, and it's under this department, we also have two other programs under this department. That's the Witness Protection Program, that is especially where in some areas of Brazil we still have militias, police forces, corrupted police forces, extrajudicially executing people and so on. We have death squads in Brazil still, and so we need a strong witness protection program, not only for that, but also because of crime and so on, organized crime. So the witness protection program today works under the Human Rights Department, which is a secretariat, which is a very unique case. In most countries, it's the Justice Department who will be working with the Witness Protection Program. In Brazil, it's the Human Rights Department. And finally, we have the Human Rights Defenders Protection Program, which is a protection program fully dedicated for the protection of environmentalists, indigenous people, tribal people, Maroon people, who are fighting for their rights, many times for the right to land, most of the time for the right to access to land. And because of that, they're threatened by local farmers who control local public authorities. And this program will try to ensure that these human rights defenders can continue to struggle for the protection of human rights without being threatened, without being taken from their place of action, from the place of struggle for human rights. Because the Witness Protection Program will take these people from that area and the human rights defenders program will try to ensure they can continue to work where they are. So, and then there are several other policies related to human replication, promotion of human rights in schools, engaging with other sectors, with the health sector, with Ministry of Education, with the Ministry of, with the police forces, training police forces on human rights. And though each department, each other ministry of Brazil have directories and people dedicated to human rights, it did make a big difference for Brazil, I believe, to have one only sector where all the efforts of human rights are concentrated, where you have one person speaking at the level of a ministry, at the second level of the governmental hierarchy, the executive hierarchy, to be advocating for human rights and to be pressuring even the justice system, where many of the problems with human rights we still have are in the justice system. So a lot of difference, and it would be really interesting to see if Ukraine, now that it's having a transition to another moment of its democracy, to incorporate a good practice.
Okay. Final questions? Останнє питання? Не, останнє. У нас так багато що вже.
Hello.
Right?
Okay, so yeah, just to conclude, so I think it would be really helpful for Ukraine.
The system is not working anymore. Втомилися.
Okay.
Okay. Final remarks.
Okay.
It looks like the system is
Yeah, I have
also.
to-
Can you hear us?
I'll begin with the presentation perhaps the connection is better. I think the presentation weighs a bit on the connection.
Okay.
Do you follow me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So I'm open for further questions. Any further questions?
There is still a question. Toля, the question is for you coming.
Yeah,
Will you
sure.
introduce yourself briefly?
So greetings, my name is Anatoly. I'm a master program student at New National University. I'm going to be...
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you too. I think I'm going to be some kind of lecturer at the university as my father wants. So, just one small question. I'm not actually, an expert in warfare or civil protest sociology, but I do deal with like freedom of information legislation. Like it's my topic on which I work on my monography work. So you have mentioned different international law sources like the Universal Declaration of 1948 and the 1966 Covenant. And so I just wanted to ask one question. Maybe of course, you know that there's the Article 19 of both of them, regards an indirect right of people to obtain information from their governments, and so perhaps it might be indoctrinated like those kind of maybe basic human rights or something like that. For example, the Convention of Tromsø in 2009, the CTS number 205 in Tromsø, Norway, it just its preamble stated it like a universal human rights. So out here in Ukraine, it is not even indoctrinated in the constitution as just a usual law. And do you consider like the access to governmental information like a universal human right? And should it be amended to all these documents like the such, not like indirect but like direct one? Like for example, it is stated in the constitution of the of the South African Republic, article number 16 is I remember.
Thank you for your question, very pertinent one. And actually, this has been the object of a document from last year, I believe, called the Training Principles. I don't know if you have consulted the Training Principles, which was a document produced by, it was produced in the city of Train in South Africa, by coincidence, and it was produced by the Open Society together with several freedom of expression special procedures of the United Nations, of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and the training principles are about access to information and national security. So you mentioned about conflict, and we were discussing here that many times government don't give access to information based on national security and so on. And the training principles, they would expressly state codifying customary international law. They affirm they codify customary international law, and I think they have a very strong authority there because you have all the special procedures supporting the elaboration of these principles. They will clarify that information has to be open for individuals. The government information has to be open for individuals, and classified information for national security purposes can only be kept as classified in very, very strict and narrow circumstances. So your question is that, do we need another treaty, another amendment on a universal level to protect this right? I believe not. I believe that the freedom of expression has to be, together with declarations and principles that explain, and case law explaining this principle, already enshrine us with a strong case for the protection of the right to information, to access to information. And the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, in a case against Chile, the name of the case just escaped me right now, but I can send you that by email later, has decided in a very small case that nobody thought it would become so big. It's a case regarding an individual that wanted to have access to information regarding some major projects of the government, construction projects and so on, a dam or something like that, environmental issues. And he asked for information of the government. He didn't have access to this information. And the Inter-American Court of Human Rights decided that freedom of expression, freedom and access to information would enshrined within the principle of freedom of information. Hence, that when the government of Chile did not respond for the requests done by this individual, it was in violation of its obligations under the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. Therefore, the court decided that governments have the duty to create special procedures for claiming access to information, deadlines, and step-by-step. And based on that decision of the Inter-American Court, which I believe you probably already have access to it, if not, I'll send you in a little while. I completely forgot the name of the case. But based on that decision, the Brazilian government approved 2 years ago our Freedom of Information Act. So it was based on a decision of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights against Chile. And this made the court and the convention engage with several governments in the region. And our Freedom of Information Act has greatly improved transparency in Brazil. And right now we're seeing several cases of corruption coming to light because the government is now more transparent. So we have, we know if I work for the government, and I don't, I used to, anyone can see what is my salary, how much I receive, when do I receive, and that enables citizens to control how public spending is done, how much money is invested on human rights, in the Human Rights Secretariat. You can go to the portal, to the website, transparency website, and check, and with that, better governance, and I would agree with you, and I think it's a very pertinent issue to write the thesis on. Freedom of information is an essential right for better governance, and will be, and I hope that it will be enshrined the post-2015 millennium, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals of post-2015. It is an essential for ensuring governance and respect for human rights broadly. And I think that we don't need an extra instrument because the instruments we have already speak about it, though they are not expressed many times. Case law, customary international law already explain freedom of expression as enshrined in that principle. So that would be in short my answer to you. I hope it's helpful. Question: do you know? Do you have access to this? Do you know which case I mean?
No, actually.
No, I'll try to open for you right now and actually just forward to you. But anyway, if there's any further question while I search that. Hmm?
I will get that on the Skype or in my email.
Okay, yeah, I'll try this actually right now if possible. So I'm just trying to find the case. So if there are any further questions, do you know if
Any other questions?
if you have any further questions?
It looks like not for a moment. Because we already exhausted our time until the end, and even more as said. I'd like to thank you very much for delivering this lecture to us and giving my colleagues and to me some assets to think about your experiences and experiences of your country. I hope the video link will be really used, and I would like just to thank you very much on that issue. And to invite you for further ideas and further projects so far. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and I hope we will have other opportunities. I found the case, so in any case, I'm sending the name of the case, and I think it can be very helpful to you. Is the case Claude Reyes versus Chile of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I strongly recommend consulting it, and also the Schrein Principles on access to information and national security.
That's very good, because there's one very hard discussions in Ukraine with regard to the ecological information. Because in the cases where the information is connected to the protection of environmental rights, sometimes it's really closed for the society, and there are, despite all existing legal instruments for requesting the information, like the law on information, law on the particular petitions of the citizens of Ukraine, and so on, but nevertheless, sometimes people are prevented of getting that information. And a lot of information with regard to the activities of the governmental bodies is really not disclosed. So like you cannot check out the expenses and so on of some sort of ministries and whatever it is. So this is like the huge discussion, and also this discussion and connected also the corruption issue in Ukraine, because as far as this information is lost, the corruption had a place to play. Anyway.
And if I can just briefly comment, I know we're exceeding time, but the interesting thing is that you just mentioned, the Claude Reyes case is actually about an environmental project. It's a project in a river in Chile, but the effects of the transparency laws that approved because of this case have reached enormous good spillover effects, not only onto the environment, but also for corruption, combating corruption, for optimizing the use of governmental resources, and for public participation in general in public affairs. So I think it's very interesting for, I believe, Ukraine, and I have the impression that it was a bit related to that as well, for corruption, lack of access to information, for the obscurity, opacity of many of the facts that were happening within the government, how decisions were being made So I think the topic has a lot to contribute for discussing and preventing further protests from occurring. But I think we're exceeding our time. But thanks so much. This was a very interesting experience for me as well. I hope we can continue to engage and discuss. And I look forward for other opportunities as well.
Okay.
Hopefully in person next time.
Thank you. I hope also.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.